The salt was a ghost. It clung to everything in the cramped, circular room at the apex of the Hawkins Point Lighthouse. The brass housing of the great Fresnel lens, the wool of Einar's sweater, the very air he breathed. It was a constant, gritty reminder of the churning gray beast that surrounded his tiny stone kingdom. For 3 months, the North Sea had been his only true neighbor, and its moods dictated his own. Today, it was furious. A late autumn storm, born somewhere in the icy void between Norway and Scotland, had thrown itself against the coast. Wind shrieked around the lantern gallery, a high, mournful sound like 1,000 grieving mothers. Rain, driven almost horizontal, hammered against the thick glass panes, each drop a tiny fist of cold. Below, the sea was a chaos of white-crested peaks and dark, fathomless troughs, crashing against the skerry with a percussive boom that vibrated up through the granite tower and into the soles of Einar's boots. He moved with the practiced, deliberate economy of a man who has learned that wasted motion is wasted energy. He checked the oil level in the lamp's reservoir, his hands steady despite the tremor in the floor. He polished a smudge from the lens with a soft chamois, his reflection a gaunt, bearded stranger staring back at him. It was a face carved by loss, the eyes holding a deep, permanent winter that the roaring lamp could not touch. He was 32, but felt ancient. It was the sound that wore him down the most. Not just the storm, but the silence it failed to mask. In this roaring solitude, the absence of Alera's laughter was a physical ache in his chest. The ghost of their daughter, little Anna's, babbling questions echoed in the howl of the wind. They had been gone for a year, taken by the influenza that had swept through their small inland village like a scythe. But for Einar, it was an open wound the salt air refused to let heal. He had taken this post to escape the pitying glances and the memories that haunted every corner of their empty cottage. He had sought isolation, believing it would be a balm. Instead, it had become an amplifier. As dusk bled into a violent, premature night, the storm intensified. A rogue wave, larger than the rest, struck the base of the lighthouse with the force of a battering ram. The entire structure groaned. A tin cup rattled off a small wooden shelf and clattered to the floor. Einar flinched, his heart hammering against his ribs. The shutter sent a fine spray of water through an infinitesimal crack in a window seal, misting the cold, curved interior wall. He watched the beads of moisture trickle down the whitewashed plaster, leaving damp, gray trails like tears. He felt a sudden, suffocating pressure in his chest. The room seemed to shrink, the rhythmic sweep of the light becoming a hypnotic, maddening pulse. 1, 2, 3, light. 1, 2, 3, dark. The world outside was gone, replaced by a symphony of wind and water and the frantic beating of his own heart. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images were there, burned onto the backs of his eyelids. Alera, her face pale with fever, her hand limp in his. Anna, her breath a shallow, rasping whisper. His hand trembled as he reached for a small, forgotten wooden box on the shelf. It had been Alera's. She was a painter, a lover of wild flowers and sunsets, her medium the delicate transparency of watercolors. He hadn't meant to bring it, but it had been tucked away in a crate of his father's old things, the previous keeper of this very light. He opened the lid. Inside lay a few hardened cakes of pigment, ochre, cerulean blue, a faded crimson, and a couple of fine-haired brushes. A ghost of her scent, of linseed oil and wild roses, seemed to rise from the box, a cruel trick of his grieving mind. Without thinking, his fingers fumbled for a brush. He dipped it into the condensation that had pooled on the windowsill, the water activating the dry, thirsty pigment. A smear of watery blue, the color of a faded summer sky. His hand moved towards the damp patch on the wall, the plaster softened by the sea spray. The movement felt alien, as if another's will was guiding his arm. He touched the brush to the wall. The color bled instantly into the damp plaster, spreading in a soft, ethereal cloud. He added a touch of ochre, then a hint of crimson. He wasn't painting, not really. He was just touching, pushing the colors around in the weeping stone. The storm raged, the light swept on, and Einar stood there, lost in a fugue of grief, his hand moving slowly, leaving faint, ghostly stains on the lighthouse wall. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The storm had broken, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and pale yellow. The sea, exhausted, rolled in gentle, rhythmic swells. Einar woke slumped in his chair, a stiff ache in his neck and the coppery taste of sorrow in his mouth. For a moment, he felt a disorienting calm. Then he saw it. On the wall, where the worst of the leak had occurred, was a faint, translucent stain. It was a formless wash of color, but within it, one could almost discern the soft curve of a cheek, a wisp of pale hair, the sad blue of a half-closed eye. It looked like a watercolor portrait that had been left in the rain, its features blurred into a haunting suggestion of a face. Shame and a cold dread washed over him. He didn't fully remember doing it. He remembered the grief, the storm, the box. He remembered the feeling of the brush. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing a wet rag and scrubbing furiously at the wall. But the pigment had seeped deep into the porous plaster. The more he rubbed, the more he seemed to work the colors into the stone, the image becoming fainter, but more permanent. It was a part of the lighthouse now, a scar. A familiar chugging sound drifted up from below, the sound of Lars's fishing boat. The old man brought his supplies once a week. Einar's heart seized. He threw the rag into a corner just as he heard Lars's heavy boots on the metal stairs. "Einar," Lars's voice boomed, a welcome intrusion of life. He appeared at the top of the stairs, his face weathered like driftwood, his eyes kind. "That was a squall to test God's own patience. You fared well?" "Well enough, Lars," Einar said, his voice hoarse. He tried to position himself to block the view of the wall, but Lars's eyes missed nothing. He set down a sack of bread and potatoes, his gaze drifting to the stained plaster. He squinted. "What's this, then? The sea trying her hand at decorating?" Einar's face flushed. "It's nothing, a leak. The salt and damp play tricks on the plaster." His tone was sharper than he intended. Lars looked from the faint image to Einar's tense face. He saw the exhaustion, the deep-seated pain that never left his eyes. He gave a slow, understanding nod, though what he understood he didn't say. "Aye, the sea has many secrets," he said softly, turning his attention back to the supplies. "As do the men who watch over it." The moment Lars's boat disappeared beyond the jagged teeth of the rocks, the fragile composure Einar had worn like an ill-fitting coat crumbled. He was left alone with the sun streaming through the high windows, illuminating the very thing he wished to hide. The mark on the wall. It wasn't just a stain, it was a testament to his unraveling, a fever dream given form. Shame, hot and sharp, pierced through the fog of his grief. What had he done? He couldn't fully recall the act, only the feeling, a desperate, clawing need to release a pressure that had been building inside him since Anya's last breath. He approached the wall cautiously, as if it were a sleeping beast. In the stark light of day, the image was fainter, more ethereal. It was undeniably the shape of a face, a woman's face, tilted in an expression of profound sadness. He saw Anya in the curve of the cheek, in the hollow of the eye. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the stone. It was cold, rough, and dry. The paint had soaked into the porous surface, becoming one with the lighthouse itself. "No," he whispered to the empty room, the sound swallowed by the thick walls. This could not remain. It was a brand of his madness. Seized by a frantic energy, he grabbed a stiff-bristled brush and a wooden bucket, filled it with seawater from the basin, and began to scrub. He put his entire weight into the effort, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The salt water foamed against the stone, and the pigment bled slightly, the ghostly blue and gray hues smearing into a murky cloud. But the shape, the impression of the face, remained. It was lighter, yes, but it was still there, a permanent specter etched into his sanctuary. Exhausted, he slumped against the opposite wall, the wet brush falling from his limp hand. He couldn't erase it. He couldn't erase her. Meanwhile, the fishing boat, the Sea Serpent, cut through the calm waters towards the bustling harbor of Alessand. Lars stood at the tiller, the smoke from his pipe mingling with the salty air, but his mind was back at Hakon's Point. Einar's face pale and drawn, the strange, unsettling mark on the wall. He was a practical man, a man of nets and tides, but what he'd seen felt wrong, unsettling. He moored the boat and headed for the general store, a sturdy wooden building that smelled of coffee, tarred rope, and dried cod. Behind the counter, organizing jars of preserves, was Ingrid, the proprietor's daughter. She had a quiet, observant way about her, with intelligent eyes that missed little. Her father, a portly man named Tomas, was weighing out nails for another customer. "Lars, good trip?" Tomas boomed, his voice hearty. "The sea was generous," Lars replied, though his tone lacked its usual vigor. He placed a list on the counter. "And I made the delivery to the lighthouse." "Ah, the new keeper, Einar," Ingrid said softly, her hands pausing their work. She remembered him and his wife Anya from their infrequent visits to the town before the sickness took her and their child. She remembered their laughter. Tomas grunted. "How is the poor lad faring? It's a lonely place for a man carrying so much sorrow." Lars shifted his weight, glancing around the store. "He is quiet, the place is clean, but there is something strange." He lowered his voice, leaning in slightly. "There's a mark on the inner wall. A stain, he called it, from the damp." "The place has always been damp," Tomas said dismissively, bagging the nails. "Not like this," Lars insisted. "This stain, it had a shape, Tomas. By all that's holy, it looked like a woman's face in the stone. Faint, like smoke, but it was there." Ingrid stopped her work entirely, her full attention on the fisherman. Her brow furrowed, not with fear, but with concern. She saw the genuine unease in Lars's eyes. "He seemed spooked when I mentioned it," Lars continued. "Said it was just the sea finding its way in, but he looked like a man who had seen a ghost and was trying to convince himself otherwise." The story, whispered in the close confines of the shop, was a spark landing on dry tinder. By evening, it had traveled from the docks to the salting houses. A face in the stone, the grieving keeper, a ghost in the lighthouse. Back at Hacken's Point, days bled into one another in a haze of monotonous duty. Einar polished the great lens until it shone, wound the clockwork mechanism that turned the light, and kept the lamps fueled. He did his best to ignore the wall, to treat it as a part of the weathered landscape of his new home. But his eyes were traitors, drawn to it in every idle moment. The faded image seemed to shift with the light, sometimes looking more like Anya, other times like a stranger lost to the sea. It wasn't a spirit haunting him, it was his own grief staring back at him. Then the weather turned. It wasn't a violent storm like the first, but a slow, suffocating fog that rolled in from the sea, swallowing the lighthouse whole. The world shrank to the confines of the stone tower. The mournful, rhythmic blast of the foghorn began its lonely vigil, a sound that seemed to vibrate in Einar's very bones. The isolation was absolute. The silence between the horn's blasts was heavier, deeper than before. The pressure started to build again, a familiar ache behind his ribs. He paced the circular room, his boots echoing on the stone floor. He tried to read, but the words swam before his eyes. He tried to sleep, but the foghorn's call kept him tethered to a miserable wakefulness. The urge came back, not as a frantic surge, but as a dull, persistent throb. An addiction. The little wooden box of watercolors on the shelf seemed to call to him. He fought it for hours, until the gray light of dusk began to fail. Defeated, he walked to the shelf. His hands, acting of their own accord, opened the box. He didn't use a brush this time. He dipped his fingers into the pot of clean water, then into the dark blue pigment, the same color as Anya's eyes in the deep of winter. He approached the wall, the pale face looking out at him from the stone. With a touch that was almost a caress, he traced a single, delicate line down the ghost's cheek. A tear. His own sorrow, now reflected in his creation. A fleeting, hollow calm washed over him. He was no longer alone in his weeping. The salt-laced wind that swept through Alessand's cobbled streets carried more than the scent of fish and brine. It carried a story. Lars's tale of the lighthouse keeper had taken on a life of its own, twisting and growing with each retelling. In the dim, cluttered interior of the general store, what began as a fisherman's unsettled account of a strange stain had fermented into a full-bodied ghost story. He said it was the face of a woman, pale as sea foam, weeping right out of the stone. One woman whispered to her neighbor, her eyes wide over a sack of flour. "My Alf says no man has lasted more than a year at Gritoya," another added, pulling her shawl tighter. "The sea claims that rock. The drowned don't rest easy there." Lars's original unease had been replaced by the villagers' morbid certainty. It was no longer Einar, the quiet man from the mainland who'd lost his family. It was the mad keeper, communing with spirits. The lighthouse wasn't just isolated, it was haunted. Leaning against a barrel near the back, Ingrid listened, her jaw tight with a frustration that bordered on anger. She had heard Lars's first telling, the one laced with genuine confusion and concern, not spectral fantasy. She heard the truth. A lonely man, a strange mark born of dampness, and a deep, unspoken sadness. Now, hearing these whispers, she felt a protective instinct rise within her. They were turning a man's private tragedy into a public spectacle, a campfire tale to ward off the chill. She knew grief. She had seen it in her own father's eyes after her mother passed. It was a quiet, hollowing thing, not a noisy phantom. She left the store, her mind made up. She found Lars down at the docks, his powerful hands methodically mending a tear in his net, his brow furrowed in concentration that failed to mask his troubled thoughts. He looked up as her shadow fell over him. "Ingrid," he grunted, not unkindly. "They're calling him the Mad Keeper," she said, her voice direct, foregoing pleasantries. "They're saying the lighthouse is haunted. That's not what you said, Lars." He sighed, a heavy, gusting sound, and stopped his work. "People hear what they want to hear. I only said what I saw. It was unsettling." "It was a man in pain," she countered, her voice softening slightly. "Think of it. To lose everyone, and then to be sent to the most solitary place on this earth. Who wouldn't be marked by such a thing?" She knelt, bringing herself to his level. "Your next supply run, I want to go with you." Lars stared at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "That's no place for you, Ingrid. The weather can turn in an instant, and the man, he's not right." "He's not right because he's alone," she insisted. "Someone needs to look him in the eye and see a man, not a ghost. You feel guilty for the stories, I can see it. Let me help you make it right. I'll bring a proper stew, some fresh bread, a small kindness. That's all." He looked out at the slate-gray water, at the distant silhouette of Gritoya, a mere speck on the horizon. He was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy, but what he'd seen had burrowed under his skin. Yet, Ingrid's logic was a steady anchor. He owed the man something more than a whispered, fearful story. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "Be ready at dawn, day after tomorrow, but if he seems dangerous, we leave." Instantly, 2 days later, the small fishing boat cut through the calm but somber sea. The sky was a sheet of unbroken gray, and the air was still and cold. Ingrid sat huddled in her thick wool coat, a basket containing a pot of lamb stew and a warm loaf of bread at her feet. As the lighthouse grew larger, its white and red bands stark against the black rock, a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. What if the villagers were right? What if Einar had truly been lost to his grief? Inside the stone tower, Einar was oblivious to their approach. The world had shrunk to the curve of the wall and the tip of his brush. The compulsion had become a familiar companion, a demanding friend. The face of his wife, Anya, was clearer now, her expression one of permanent, gentle sorrow. But he wasn't alone with her anymore. Yesterday, in a fresh wave of agony, his hand, guided by a force he no longer questioned, had painted something new. Beside Anya's cheek, faint and almost translucent, was the shape of a small hand, its fingers uncurling as if reaching for her. It was their son, Eric. The image was incomplete, a ghost reaching for a ghost, and the sight of it was a constant, crushing weight on his soul. He heard the boat's engine as a distant intrusion, a violation of his sanctuary. He felt a surge of panic and anger. He was not ready for the world. He scrambled down the spiral stairs, his heart pounding, just as a firm but gentle knock echoed on the heavy wooden door. He wrenched it open, ready to snarl at Lars, to tell him to leave the supplies and go. But it wasn't Lars who stood before him. It was a young woman, her face framed by a simple wool scarf, her blue eyes clear and steady. Behind her, Lars hovered nervously by the boat, looking like he'd rather face a rogue wave. Einar stared, speechless. He was gaunt, his eyes sunken and shadowed, his hair unkempt. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to speak to another human being. Ingrid offered a small, hesitant smile. "Mr. Einar, I'm Ingrid. I came with Lars. I brought you some stew." She held up the basket, a simple, disarming offering. The gesture was so unexpected, so normal, that it broke through his defensive shell. He looked from her face to the basket and back again, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He gave a stiff, jerky nod and stepped back, allowing her to enter the ground floor chamber. The air was cold, smelling of damp stone and linseed oil. Ingrid's gaze swept the room, taking in the sparse furniture, the neatly stacked crates from Lars's last visit, and then she saw it. On the curved interior wall, illuminated by the cold light from the doorway, was the painting. It was larger and more detailed than she had imagined. The sorrowful woman's face was unmistakable, the tear a dark track on the pale cheek. And beside it, the new addition, the faint, heartbreaking outline of a child's hand. It wasn't a ghost. It was a memorial. A raw, desperate, beautiful scream of grief painted onto cold stone. Einar watched her, his body tensed, waiting for the gasp, the fear, the whispered accusation. It's just the damp," he mumbled, the lie weak and pathetic even to his own ears. "The salt makes strange patterns." Ingrid didn't look away from the wall. She didn't recoil. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, filled not with fear, but with a profound, aching empathy. "She's beautiful," Ingrid said softly. Then her eyes shifted to the tiny, reaching hand. "They both are," Einar froze. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow, shattering the silence of his isolation. He had expected terror or revulsion. He had prepared for pity or scorn. He was not prepared for understanding. For the first time in months, someone had looked at his secret, his shame, and had not seen a monster or a ghost, but a husband and a father. The silence that followed Ingrid's departure was profoundly different from the one that had preceded it. Before, silence was a heavy shroud, thick with unshed tears and unspoken grief. Now, it was a vast, empty space, echoing with the memory of her soft voice and the warmth of her understanding gaze. Einar stood before the mural for a long time, the lantern light flickering across the pale face on the wall. He no longer saw just a haunting stain of his own making. He saw what she had seen, a memorial. A thing of sorrow, yes, but also of beauty. The shame that had clung to him like a sea mist began to recede, leaving behind a raw, aching vulnerability he hadn't felt in months. It was terrifying, but it was also the first thing that had felt truly alive. Days turned into a week. The storms abated, replaced by a period of calm, gray skies where the sun was a soft, milky disk behind the clouds. Einar found himself watching the coastline not with dread, but with a nervous anticipation. He would scan the horizon for the familiar shape of Lars's fishing boat, his heart giving a small, unfamiliar lurch when he finally spotted it. True to her unspoken promise, Ingrid returned. Lars remained in his boat, his posture stiff with reluctance, but he brought her each time. Their first few visits established a quiet routine. Ingrid would bring a small parcel, a loaf of dark rye bread still warm from the oven, a jar of cloudberry jam, a book of poems by Wergeland. She never commented on the state of the lighthouse, on Einar's unkempt beard, or the lingering scent of salt and sorrow. She would simply sit on the wooden crate near the door, her hands folded in her lap, and speak of small things. She talked about the fishing catch, the mending of the nets, an argument between two gulls over a scrap of fish. Her conversation was a gentle tide, washing over the shores of his solitude without demanding anything in return. Einar rarely spoke. He would listen, his eyes fixed on her face or on the restless sea outside the door. He answered her direct questions with a nod or a clipped, one-word response. Yet, something inside him was shifting. He found himself cleaning the lower level before her expected arrival, sweeping the stone floor and wiping down the small table. He trimmed his lamp wicks with more care, ensuring the light was steady and bright. One morning, looking at his reflection in a murky pane of glass, he was struck by the wildness in his own eyes. He spent 20 minutes painstakingly trimming his beard with a rusty pair of shears, the snip, snip, snip of the metal a small, rhythmic act of reclaiming himself. During her fourth visit, Ingrid brought a basket containing thread, needles, and a patch of sturdy canvas. "I saw your coat when you were outside," she said, her voice even, without a hint of judgment. "The elbow is nearly worn through. The winter winds will find that hole." Einar merely grunted in acknowledgement, taking the basket. But later that night, after she had gone, he sat by the lantern's glow and began to mend the coat. His fingers, clumsy from disuse, struggled with the fine needle and thread. The work was slow, frustrating. Several times he was tempted to throw it into the fire, but he thought of her calm, practical gaze, and he persisted. Stitch by stitch, he closed the hole. It was a clumsy, uneven patch, but it was strong. As he held the repaired sleeve, a profound sense of accomplishment settled over him. It was the first thing he had fixed, the first act of preservation, since the world had broken. The watercolors his wife had owned remained on the small shelf, untouched. The compulsion to add to the mural had vanished, replaced by a quiet contemplation. The painting was no longer a raw, open wound that he needed to tend to. It was a scar. It was a part of him now, a fixed point in his history, and Ingrid's acceptance had allowed him to stop picking at it. One afternoon, the sky was a rare, brilliant blue, the sea calm and glittering under the sun. Ingrid was sitting on her usual crate, gazing out at the water. "It's a fierce blue today," she remarked softly. "Almost hurts the eyes to look at it." Einar, who had been oiling the lamp mechanism, paused. The rag in his hand went still. The color. It was the exact shade of the shawl she had bought at the market in Bergen, the one she wrapped around herself on cool summer evenings. The memory rose in him, not with the usual crushing weight, but with a startling clarity, a sweet, poignant ache. He could almost smell the wool, see the way the color brought out the light in her eyes. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and alien in the quiet room. "Anya," he said. The name felt heavy on his tongue, a stone he hadn't moved in over a year. "My wife, she had a shawl this color. She loved it." Ingrid turned her head slowly. Her expression didn't change. There was no pity, no intrusive curiosity. There was only a deep, quiet listening. She held his gaze for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of the name he had shared, of the precious memory he had offered. Then she smiled, a small, gentle curve of her lips. "It's a beautiful color," she said simply. That was all. The conversation moved on, but the stone had been lifted. A name had been spoken. A memory had been shared, not buried. Later that evening, long after the silhouette of Lars's boat had faded into the twilight, Einar felt a different kind of restlessness. It wasn't the frantic energy of grief. It was something quieter, more creative. He ignored the watercolors. Instead, he found a small, charred stick from the stove and a clean, flat piece of driftwood he'd saved. He sat at the table, and under the steady, mended lamplight, he began to sketch the image of a gannet he had seen diving that afternoon, its wings sharp and angled against the vast, blue sky. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm as gentle as the tides on a calm day. The lighthouse, once a stone tomb, began to breathe again. Einar, guided by Ingrid's quiet encouragement, had scrubbed the salt grime from the windows, polished the brass of the lantern mechanism until it shone, and even mended the loose step on the winding staircase. Each small act was a reclamation, a quiet defiance of the inertia that had held him captive. Ingrid's visits were the anchor to his week. She brought news from Alessand, fresh bread, and a presence that asked for nothing but offered everything. They would sit at the small wooden table, the air filled with the scent of coffee and the sea, and talk. Or, more accurately, she would talk, and he would listen, his replies growing from monosyllabic grunts to considered phrases. One bright, windswept afternoon, as gulls wheeled and cried against a brilliant blue sky, Ingrid pointed to the small wooden bird he had carved. It now sat on the windowsill, its form simple but full of life. "He looks like he's ready to fly," she said, her smile warming the cool air of the lower room. Einar picked it up, his thumb stroking the smooth grain of the driftwood. "Anya, she loved the puffins," he said, the name coming more easily this time. A memory, sharp and sweet, surfaced through the fog of grief. "We used to watch them from the cliffs near our cottage. Our boy, Eric, he would laugh so hard when they'd land, all clumsy and top-heavy. He called them sea clowns." It was the most he had spoken of his family in years. A dam of sorrow and memory had broken, but instead of a destructive flood, it was a gentle, cleansing stream. He looked at Ingrid, his eyes clear and filled with a profound, aching gratitude. She didn't offer platitudes or pity, she simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the preciousness of what he had shared. This newfound peace was fragile, a delicate shell washed ashore, and the outside world was an incoming tide. The monthly supply boat, the Fjordlass, arrived not with Lars at the helm, but with its regular captain, a stout, weather-beaten man named Olav. He and his mate unloaded crates of oil, flour, salt fish, and mail with practiced efficiency. "Good to see the place looking shipshape, Einar," Olav grunted, wiping his brow. "Keeping you busy, I see." Einar gave a small nod, a flicker of pride in his chest. As they prepared to leave, Olav handed him a final, official-looking envelope sealed with wax. "This came for you, from the Lighthouse Authority in Bergen." He clapped Einar on the shoulder. "Just a heads up. Inspector Hagen is doing his coastal rounds. He'll be here in a fortnight. He's a stickler for the regulations, that one. Likes his walls clean and his logbooks perfect. Best have everything in order." Olav winked, thinking he was offering a friendly tip, oblivious to the grenade he had just rolled into the center of Einar's carefully reconstructed world. The roar of the Fjordlass's engine faded, leaving behind a silence that was suddenly heavy and suffocating. Einar stood frozen on the landing rock, the letter cold in his hand. "Inspector Hagen, a fortnight, likes his walls clean." The words echoed in his head, each one a hammer blow against the fragile sanctuary he had built. He stumbled back inside, his gaze immediately drawn to the spiraling staircase that led up to the light and to the wall. The wall that held Anya's face, her tear, Eric's small, reaching hand. It wasn't a painting. It was a scar on his soul made visible, a sacred text written in grief and water and salt. The thought of a stranger, a man of regulations and ledgers, standing before it, judging it, ordering it erased, it was unthinkable. A cold sweat broke out on his skin. The air grew thick, the familiar scent of brine and oil turning rancid in his nostrils. The old panic, the feeling of drowning on dry land, began to claw at the edges of his calm. He didn't know how long he stood there, paralyzed by a terror he thought he had left behind. It was the sound of Ingrid's boat that broke the spell. She had seen the Fjordlass from the shore and had come over, curious about the delivery. She found him standing at the base of the stairs, pale and trembling, the official letter crushed in his fist. "Einar, what is it? You look as if you've seen a ghost." The irony was lost on him. He couldn't speak, merely gesturing with the crumpled paper towards the upper levels. She took the letter, smoothed it out, and read it. Her expression shifted from curiosity to a deep, immediate understanding. Her eyes didn't dart to the wall, but to him. She saw not the violation of a rule, but the imminent desecration of a heart. "A fortnight," she said softly, her voice a calm current in his sea of panic. He finally found his voice, a raw whisper. "He will make me paint over it. It's a government wall. He will see filth, a stain." His breath hitched. I will not." He looked at her, his desperation laid bare. "It is all I have left of them, that is real." Ingrid stepped closer, her presence a shield against his rising fear. She placed a hand gently on his arm. "No," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "It is not a stain, it is a memorial, and you will not face him alone." She looked from his tormented face up the staircase, towards the painted ghost that had brought them together. "We will face him, together." The 2 weeks that followed the harbor master's warning passed in a state of suspended animation. An unnerving calm settled over the island, the sea a placid mirror of the vast, gray sky. For Einar, it was a quiet torment. He and Ingrid worked with a silent, focused intensity, preparing for the inspector's arrival. They scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, polished the brass fittings of the great lantern until they shone like captured suns, and meticulously organized the storeroom. The lighthouse had never been so immaculate, a model of order and efficiency that stood in stark contrast to the turmoil in Einar's soul. Every action was an attempt to build a fortress of compliance around the one unforgivable breach of regulation: the soft, ethereal figures on the wall. They never spoke of it directly, but it was the center of their shared gravity. Sometimes, while polishing the lens, Einar would catch Ingrid's gaze from across the room, and in her eyes, he would see the same resolve that was struggling to take root in his own heart. She was his anchor in this quiet storm. On the morning of the inspection, the air was still and heavy with the scent of salt and damp stone. A single boat, small and purposeful, cut a sharp line through the tranquil water, heading directly for their shore. Einar stood at the base of the lighthouse, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. Ingrid stood a few feet behind him, a silent pillar of support. She had brought a small loaf of bread and a flask of coffee, simple offerings of normalcy against the impending judgment. The man who stepped onto the jetty was exactly as Einar had pictured. Inspector Hagen was compact and severe, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored coat that seemed to repel the sea air. His face was all sharp angles and deep-set eyes, his thinning hair combed rigidly across his scalp. He carried a leather satchel and a clipboard, the twin instruments of his authority. He nodded curtly at Einar, his gaze sweeping over him in a quick, dismissive appraisal. He barely acknowledged Ingrid's presence. "Keeper Einar Johansson." Hagen's voice was crisp, devoid of warmth. "Yes, sir, Inspector Hagen." Einar's own voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat. "Let us begin. I will start with the exterior, then the storeroom, and we will work our way up. I trust the logbook is in order." It wasn't a question. The inspection was a masterclass in meticulous scrutiny. Hagen ran a gloved finger along the stone mortar, tested the tension on the winch cable, and measured the remaining fuel in the barrels with a dipstick, making sharp, precise notes on his clipboard. Inside, he was even more thorough. He checked the seals on the windows, the state of the rations, and the organization of the supplies. Einar followed him like a shadow, his anxiety mounting with every tick of Hagen's pen. Ingrid remained in the small kitchen area, a quiet observer, her presence a constant, reassuring pressure at Einar's back. Finally, they began the ascent up the winding staircase. The air grew cooler, the silence broken only by their footsteps on the iron treads. Hagen paused on each landing, tapping the walls, his expression unreadable. Einar felt his heart hammer against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He was certain Hagen could hear it. Then they reached the chamber, the heart of the lighthouse, the space where Anya and Axel lived on the wall. Hagen, however, walked right past it, his attention fixed on the magnificent Fresnel lens. He spent a long time there, examining every prism, every brass joint, every polished surface. He quizzed Einar on cleaning schedules and lighting protocols. Einar answered mechanically, his mind screaming. He couldn't look at the wall. After what felt like an eternity, Hagen seemed satisfied. He made a final note on his clipboard with a decisive flick of his wrist. "The machinery is in excellent condition, Johansson, commendable." A tiny spark of relief flickered in Einar's chest. It was extinguished almost immediately. As they turned to descend, Hagen stopped. He had been so focused on the lantern that he had missed it on the way in. Now, in the diffused light from the windows, the painting was impossible to ignore. It was faint, yes, but undeniably there, the gentle curve of a woman's face, the smaller shape nestled against her. Hagen's body went rigid. He took 2 steps closer to the wall, his head tilted. The silence stretched, thin and fragile. Einar felt the blood drain from his face. "What?" Inspector Hagen said, his voice dangerously low. "Is this?" Einar's throat closed. Words failed him. He could only stare, horrified, as the inspector ran a finger near the image. his expression hardening from curiosity to cold disapproval. "This is government property, Keeper. Regulations are explicit. There are to be no unauthorized markings, no defacement of any kind." It was then that Ingrid moved. She stepped forward, not in front of Einar, but beside him. She placed a hand lightly on his forearm. The warmth of her touch was a lifeline. Einar took a shuddering breath and looked away from the inspector, fixing his gaze on the painting. He looked at Anya. He saw her smile, not the one on the wall, but the one in his memory, the one she wore as she held Axel by the shore on a sunny afternoon. "She is my wife," Einar said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the heavy silence. "Anya, and this is my son Axel." Hagen turned his steely gaze to Einar. "I am not concerned with who they are meant to be. I am concerned with what they are. And what they are is a violation." "It happened after the storm," Einar continued, finding a strange strength in saying their names aloud to this stranger. "The big one, when I first arrived, I don't remember doing it. I found it the next morning. It was just there." He finally looked at Hagen, his eyes pleading. "I couldn't bring myself to cover them. It would be like losing them all over again." Ingrid spoke, her voice calm and steady. "Inspector, since this painting appeared, Einar has become the most dedicated keeper this light has ever had. He cares for this place as if it were his own home, because, in a way, it is. It is where he keeps his family safe." Hagen's expression remained hard, but a flicker of something, uncertainty, perhaps, crossed his eyes. He looked from the desperate sincerity on Einar's face to the quiet strength in Ingrid's. He glanced at the pristine logbook on its lectern, then back at the faint figures on the wall. The regulations were black and white. This situation was 100 shades of gray. He let out a long, slow sigh, the first sign of humanity he had shown. "The regulations exist for a reason, Johansson, to ensure uniformity, safety, and longevity. The moisture in these walls will cause that paint to peel and flake. It will damage the plaster beneath. It is, from a maintenance perspective, an inevitability of decay." He paused, tapping his pen against his clipboard. "I will not be noting it in my official report. This time," the words hung in the air. "Consider this a warning, not a reprieve. The sea and the winter will do my job for me eventually. When it begins to degrade, you are to scrape it clean and apply a proper sealant. I will not have rot setting into the walls of my lighthouse. Is that understood?" Einar could only nod, a wave of dizzying relief washing over him. "Yes, sir, understood." "Good." Hagen gave one last, long look at the mural, then turned and descended the stairs without another word. Einar and Ingrid watched him go, listening as his footsteps faded. They heard the front door open, then close. A few minutes later, the sound of the boat's engine starting up drifted back to them, growing fainter until it was swallowed by the immense silence of the sea. They were alone again. Einar slowly reached out and traced the outline of his son's head on the wall, his touch feather-light. They had faced the beast, and they were still standing. The painting was still there. It was a temporary victory, a stay of execution granted not by rules, but by a moment of conflicted humanity. He turned to Ingrid, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. For the first time in a long time, they were not tears of sorrow, but of profound, weary gratitude. The chugging of Inspector Hagen's boat faded until it was consumed by the vast, indifferent sigh of the North Sea. Silence descended upon the tower, thick and heavy with unspoken words. Einar stood frozen before the mural, his knuckles white where he gripped the railing. He had not moved since the inspector left. Ingrid remained a few steps behind him, a quiet, solid presence. The air tasted of salt and a fragile, terrifying relief. He finally let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 2 weeks. It came out as a ragged shudder. He is gone. "He is, Einar," Ingrid said softly, stepping to his side. She didn't look at the painting, but at him. Her eyes, the color of a calm fjord, held no triumph, only a deep, shared exhaustion. "We are safe. For now," he whispered, his gaze tracing the faint, beloved lines on the wall. Hagen's words echoed in his mind. "When it begins to decay." It wasn't a pardon, it was a stay of execution. The dampness of the stone, the salt in the air, the very nature of the lighthouse that had preserved his grief would now become its destroyer. He had won a battle, but the war against time and weather was unwinnable. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm established itself, built upon the foundation of that shared victory. Einar performed his duties with a meticulousness that was less about escaping his thoughts and more about embracing his purpose. He polished the great lens until it shone like a captured star, his movements steady and sure. Ingrid's visits became a regular feature of his life, as reliable as the turning of the tide. She brought him fresh bread, news from the village, and a simple, grounding companionship that asked nothing of him but his presence. Yet, a new tension coiled within him. Every morning, his first act was to inspect the mural. He'd run his fingers near the wall, feeling for moisture, his eyes searching for the slightest flake of paint, the smallest sign of the decay Hagen had prophesied. The mural, once his sanctuary, had become a fragile patient he was powerless to heal. It was a constant, low-level hum of anxiety beneath the surface of his newfound peace. One evening, as they sat sharing a simple meal of dried fish and potatoes, Ingrid watched him glance toward the wall for the third time. "You are watching it like a hawk watches a field mouse," she said gently. Einar sighed, setting down his fork. "Hagen's words, they are a promise. Every drop of sea spray, every bit of damp, it feels like a threat now. I am guarding a ghost that is already fading." "Perhaps," Ingrid said, her gaze thoughtful, "the memory is not in the paint, Einar. Perhaps the paint was only the window you looked through to find it." Her words settled in his mind, unsettling but true. He had needed the image, the tangible proof of his loss, because the memory itself was too painful to hold. But now he could speak of them. He could tell Ingrid about the way Anna's hair would catch the summer light, or how little Lars would squeal with delight when chased by gulls on the shore. The stories were coming back, not as daggers of pain, but as warm, smooth stones in the palm of his hand. His true test came with the autumn gales. A storm, less ferocious than the one that had first broken him but relentless in its assault, raged for 2 days. Wind howled around the tower, and waves, like angry fists, hammered against the granite base. A fine, persistent mist worked its way through invisible cracks in the stone, making the interior walls slick with moisture. Einar's heart hammered in time with the waves. He stayed away from the mural, afraid of what he would find. When the storm finally broke on the third morning, the world was washed clean and quiet. With trembling legs, he climbed the stairs. There, just as he had feared, a dark trickle of water had run from the ceiling, right through the image of his son. The watercolor pigment, never meant for such a surface, had blurred. The faint, delicate shape of Lars's hand reaching for his mother was now a faint, blue-green smudge. A wave of cold grief washed over him, familiar and sickening. His first instinct was to despair, to curse the sea, the stone, the inspector. He reached out a trembling hand to touch the ruined spot, but as his fingers met the cold, damp wall, something shifted. He looked at the blurred image, then at the still intact face of his Anna. Her smile was gentle, serene, but it was just a whisper of color on stone. He closed his eyes. Instantly, a different image filled his mind. Lars, not as a faint painting, but alive, his face alight with laughter, cheeks red from the wind, his small, warm hand clasped firmly in his own. He could hear Anna's voice, clear as a bell, calling their son's name. Ingrid was right. The mural was the window, but he didn't need it anymore. The memories weren't on the wall, they were in him. They had been there all along, buried under the weight of his sorrow. His conversations with Ingrid, the sharing of his stories, had been the key that unlocked them. The painting had served its purpose. It had held his grief until he was strong enough to hold it himself. When Ingrid arrived later that day, carrying a basket with a warm loaf of bread, she found him not by the lamp, but standing calmly before the mural. The look on his face was one of serenity she had never seen before. "It's time," he said simply. She understood immediately. Without a word, she set down her basket and went with him to the small storage room. Together, they mixed a bucket of whitewash. The process was quiet, solemn, but not sad. It felt less like an erasure and more like a ritual of release. Einar took the first brushstroke. The thick, white paint covered the faint image of his wife's face. There was no pain, no hesitation. With each stroke, he was not destroying a memory, but liberating himself from the ghost of one. He was choosing to carry his family inside him, in the warmth of his heart, rather than in the cold damp of the stone. Ingrid worked beside him, her presence a silent testament to the future they were painting into existence. When they were finished, the wall was a blank, clean white, reflecting the bright light from the great lamp above. The tower felt lighter, the air clearer. They stepped outside onto the narrow walkway. The sea, now calm after the storm, stretched out before them, a vast expanse of shimmering blue. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden path across the water. Einar took Ingrid's hand, his grip firm and sure. "Anna always said," he began, his voice steady and clear, "that the sunset was the sea's way of tucking the world in for the night." He smiled, a true, unburdened smile. He was still Einar, the lighthouse keeper. He would always be a man who had known profound loss, but he was no longer a man haunted by ghosts on a wall. He was a man holding the hand of the woman who had helped him find his way back, looking toward the horizon, ready for the light of a new day.